I'm so sorry that we're starting a few minutes late over here, but I am going to hand it over right away to these incredible speakers. I don't know if you can see my slide, but I will just get right out of the way now and let them take over. I'm excited to learn about AI readiness and adoption amongst Indian nonprofits. So take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ragini. I'm the India Data Partnerships Consultant for GivingTuesday, and we're very happy to welcome you to today's session on AI readiness and adoption amongst Indian nonprofits. Today, we will spotlight key data from Indian organizations, examine how India aligns with and diverges from global trends, and explore some practical ways in which the international community can support thoughtful AI development in India's social sector. We're very glad to be joined today by two experts, Nivedita Krishna from Pacta and Astha Kapoor from the Aapti Institute, who will also be sharing their valuable perspectives on the topic. So before we dive right in, I'm going to give you some background on where this research came from. Giving Tuesday began in 2012 as a very simple idea, a day encouraging people to do good. It's since grown into a global movement, inspiring hundreds of millions of people worldwide to give as communities, as coalitions, and as caring individuals. Part of that movement is the Giving Tuesday Data Commons, which is a global network which is striving to better understand and grow generosity around the world, especially from everyday givers. The Data Commons convenes and conducts collaborative research into giving-related behaviors, reveals trends in generosity, and shares findings amongst its global community. GTDC convenes specialized working groups and conducts research into giving-related behaviors under specific themes. And one of these specialized working groups is centered on generosity and AI. In March of 2024, the Giving Tuesday Generosity AI Working Group launched the AI Readiness Survey to assess how social sector organizations worldwide are adapting to the growing influence of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. This research explores organizations' capacity to adopt AI, their comfort levels, and the barriers they face. A key goal of this research was defining what we're calling AI readiness by measuring current usage, applications, and organizational traits linked to adoption, establishing a shared understanding for responsible AI deployment in the social sector. This study was conducted with a global sample, and within that, there was a significant subset of Indian organizations, specifically 251 of them. And the AI Readiness Report for India was developed as a supplement to the global study, focusing exclusively on insights from these 251 organizations. It was created to explore the unique dynamics of AI adoption in India's nonprofit sector and establish a better understanding of the distinct challenges and opportunities within this context. So India is still in the early stages of AI adoption, particularly within the nonprofit sector. Many organizations are just beginning to explore AI, often starting with simpler tools like generative AI. And our survey showed that almost a third of respondents had never used AI in any form. The majority of the respondents had used it, and a small minority had used all forms of AI. So we're seeing quite a lot of range, with a good number of organizations not having really experimented much at all. So we tried to make sense of this in a few different ways. Funding organizations have typically sought to categorize organizations by whether they can implement small or large-scale services and interventions, and those categories depend on a multitude of factors: staff size, age, geographic reach, and local or subject matter expertise. So we wanted to know whether these factors were good predictors of whether an organization was incorporating AI into their work. And if not, what was a good predictor? We used all relevant survey answers to calculate two key composite scores for organizational capacity and AI readiness. Capacity reflects an organization's overall ability to absorb funding and implement projects affecting a larger geographical scope. And we were looking at, again, staff, age, and regionality of the organization. Readiness scores add up all of the behaviors that we would use to assess an organization's ability to adopt and implement AI solutions. So things like how and what data an organization collects, technical staff, data policies, and current utilization of AI. Okay, so we ran a cluster analysis, which identified two distinct groups based on their actual AI use and organizational characteristics. First, early adopters. This group is a typically larger urban organization. Well, it contains typically larger urban organizations with stronger infrastructure. So that includes more staff, more formal data use policies, data collection and storage, as well as dedicated technical personnel such as IT or monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning, acronym is MERL staff. They've built the foundational systems that make AI adoption feasible. The second group is late adopters. Conversely, these are smaller, often rural organizations with limited technical resources and infrastructure. And interestingly, while they're less likely to have data policies or be collecting large amounts of data, they're actually more likely to employ MERL specialists or IT specialists, suggesting that that technical capacity exists, but it isn't necessarily translating to AI readiness. So what we can already see is that this isn't simply about organization size or age. It's about a number of other factors, including technical infrastructure and data maturity. And in the next section of the conversation, we'll be diving a little bit deeper into these themes. All right, so how are organizations currently using AI? Our cluster analysis revealed two distinct groups, early and late adopters, as I just said. Here's what separates them in the application of AI. So late adopters, primarily these smaller rural organizations, they showed limited data engagement across all of the categories that we measured. Critically, only about 10% express interest in using AI beyond basic generative tools like ChatGPT. And in contrast, early adopters, these predominantly larger urban organizations, they had 60 to 80% who were wanting to expand AI use across multiple applications. So this appetite gap is pretty striking. Early adopters are 2 to 3 more times likely to expand their data use or want to expand their data use. And perhaps most telling is that 40% of the late adopters still don't really know what they'd like to use AI for. So this suggests some kind of a gap in fundamental awareness and capacity rather than just technological barriers. So this urban-rural, large-small divide has important implications for global funders and any intermediaries thinking about AI capacity building in India. The challenge isn't just about tools, it's also about foundational data literacy and organizational readiness. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about organizational capacity and data use, these factors. We'll dive into this topic and bring in our first expert in just a moment. So this visual shows up how early and late adopters differ in their current use of data, their current use of AI, and their future preferences for the use of AI. The analysis revealed fascinating divergences between India and global patterns. So first, Indian organizations, especially smaller ones, significantly lag in data use policies compared to global averages. But as we mentioned earlier, they're twice as likely to employ technical and MERL staff as organizations elsewhere. This breaks the global rule that we observed, where tech or MERL personnel typically predicted higher AI adoption. In India, both early and late adopters are equally likely to have this technical staff, but it's not translating. That's an interesting aberration. This disconnect suggests while India has technical human capacity, organizations lack the systematic data infrastructure that enables effective AI use. So larger organizations hire more specialists than global peers, but they're less likely to engage in collaborative data agreements. So it seems to suggest that India needs more targeted investment in data governance and infrastructure beyond staff and building better systems to leverage that existing expertise. So I'm going to ask our first expert, Nivedita Krishna, to come in here to share some of her thoughts on these trends and why we're seeing these outcomes.
Really lovely to be here. Important conversation. My name is Nivedita. I have founded an organization called Pacta. And around the same time last year, we began sort of thinking about how AI has been adopted by the not-for-profit sector or the impact sector in India, mostly in their programmatic sort of uses. And we thought that as this conversation was shaping up, we were seeing a lot of large nonprofits use AI in their programmatic interventions. Not much really was being written about, some of these patterns as they evolved. And at Pacta, we actually are a law firm and think tank, which means we do legal support for nonprofits. And through that vantage, we're often given early access to the way nonprofits are thinking about adopting technology, digitization. And really what we found through conversations with about 30 nonprofits across, again, various sizes, looking at AI was that this sort of inquisitivity was, equal across sizes of organizations. But it did look like the larger organizations did have the propensity to do sort of very serious pilots, which were then getting scaled up either through government partnerships or their own interventions. Right. And this propensity of sort of doing high scale AI implementation, you are right, also did not sort of translate into backed up practices in terms of having a very clear AI adoption strategy or a data strategy, or when we asked nonprofits about whether they had agreements or even data protection policies, we did not get very clear answers. Some of the reasons for that are that I think very fundamentally, India did not have a data protection law that was explicit, right? Though it was sort of collapsed under India's information technology law, we did not have an explicit law. And so just as in 2023, India's data privacy law has come into place, nonprofits are beginning to embrace their obligations of data protection. Right. And even generally, we see as lawyers that support nonprofits that nonprofits are not legal first, they're not compliance first. There are several explanations for that. One is simply the lack of funding, and compliance begins to get classified as administrative sort of expense, and then the resources that are allocated towards compliance governance automatically sort of begins to dwindle. And alongside that, it's extremely funder driven. And so while I think this pattern of seeing the presence of an MERL person, the propensity to collect data, all being very funder driven sort of practices where funders want data from the ground. Similarly with big tech, right, one of their biggest motivations to do AI for impact was that they were getting sort of data from the ground. They were able to experiment, look at whether these evolving technologies had the propensity to solve on the ground problems. They were also excited about partnerships with government schools, with government hospitals, and really even government departments sort of taking up some of this, right? So very top-down driven sort of tech adoption, and then habits that get formed at the bottom being non-compliant, sort of leaning, right? And that's really not even a priority. Thinking generally in India is that benevolence need not be sort of regulated. The attitude generally is that if you're doing good, then I don't think there is a need for a law to tell me how to do good, right? So I think with some of this, I would say the capacity to think about risk mitigation, therefore, is not yet there, and there is this tendency to think about AI as this magic wand that is going to solve a lot of problems, make your everyday so much easier. But the thinking really about what risks that this brings, and how one must think about a risk matrix, risk mitigation, think about some of these relationships with big tech as being power driven, data driven, and therefore the sort of exposure or sort of vulnerability of nonprofits to big tech relationships really hasn't yet matured, I would say, in India. These were some of our observations.
Oh, that's perfect, Nivedita. Thanks. And that kind of segues us well into our next theme, which is perceptions of risk. So I will kind of walk through some of the findings on that topic first, and then I will bring in our next expert. All right. So when we examined how Indian organizations perceive AI risks versus reward, there were, again, clear differences that emerged between our two groups, India versus global. AI late adopters versus early adopters. Early adopters are confident about AI. They see more reward than risk, and they report higher comfort levels using AI in their work. And this aligns with their hands-on experience experimenting with multiple AI applications. But in late adopters, we're seeing a different story. They're a bit more cautious, they're seeing greater risk than reward, but perhaps most telling of all is that about half of late adopters either can't evaluate the risks or they see risk and reward as equal. So this suggests that they lack the experience base to make some more informed judgments. Interestingly, about a quarter of both of these groups remain neutral about AI comfort, so there's still some uncertainty amongst even those who started experimenting. And in the next slide, we look at some kind of the differences between India versus the global cohort. And then we also teased out a subset of tech organizations to see how that kind of orientation affected things. So globally, data breaches topped the concern list. So tech-oriented nonprofits showed heightened worry that across most risk categories, especially around bias. And interestingly, job displacement was one area where tech professionals weren't really very much concerned. India presents a very contrasting picture. Across nearly every risk category, Indian organizations express significantly less concern than their global counterparts. And our assessment is that this is likely not indifference, it reflects just a different assessment of the risk landscape. So Indian organizations are generally more optimistic about AI benefits and less focused on the potential dangers. And this may stem from, as Nivedita mentioned, kind of our nascent stage sort of status in developing data protection and that regulatory environment compared to regions with more established privacy frameworks like the GDPR in Europe. And for the international community, this presents an opportunity, again, to kind of support the knowledge base amongst Indian nonprofits and support capacity building that helps to develop a more kind of sophisticated and mature assessment of the risk landscape, and to help Indian organizations have their own kind of informed approaches about evaluating AI opportunities and challenges. The goal isn't necessarily more caution across the board, but building the capacity to kind of make an analysis of where the opportunities lie for them and making context-appropriate decisions on adopting AI. So with that, I'm going to bring in Astha to share some of her thoughts on this topic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I think a lot of what I'm going to say sort of trails off from where Nivedita left off, which is that there's a question of risk, but it emanates from the question of readiness and also this sort of like hustle to AI, which is that in the ecosystem, funders, the government, everybody's like, oh, nonprofits should adapt and adopt to AI. So I think that when you get into something like anything in life without ample readiness, knowledge, information, you are likely to be more vulnerable to risk. And that risk in the context of AI manifests itself in different ways, right? So there's risk at the level of misinformation and disinformation that is AI generated, but nonprofits that work on the ground don't necessarily have the tools to combat that and are often prey to it, right? Also, things like data breaches, loss of privacy, all of these risks that we hear about in the context of AI are things that nonprofits have to face without ample readiness to be resilient or to avoid these risks. So they become both the site of harm as well as victims of harm in very many ways. The other thing that we've also noticed in our work is that what ends up happening is that nonprofits become also a site of a lot of data extraction about the community because they are at the last mile, the repository of a lot of data, which is necessary for training of AI models. So they become the points where you go collect that data. You become sort of like the data labelers for this entire ecosystem, which you do unknowingly and unwittingly, right? Which adds, and Nivedita also alluded to this, a lot of labor on the part of the nonprofits themselves, which are already doing the things that they have to do, which is the delivery of goods and services or whatever the mandate is. But now what's added onto that is this enormous burden of collecting data that they don't know how to extract value from. They don't know how to use that data to give value back to the community. It just becomes this like mechanism of burden, right? So how do we make sure that nonprofits that have been investing time in fundamentally labeling data for all of these big models have a certain set of negotiation around it? And the way that we at the Aapti Institute have been thinking about this is that we think that nonprofits are necessary friction in this techno solutionism that we are seeing, which is that our community-based organizations in particular are the sort of bulwark between the community and all the people who are looking to extract data. They have almost a responsibility to communicate the harms of AI to the people. They have the responsibility to negotiate with funders and the government, and say no when it comes to certain kinds of questions. And we see this role as the role of a data steward, right? Because you are already in a position to steward the interests of the community. Are you also able to steward the interests of the community with regard to data and AI? So these are the kinds of roles that I think civil society organizations can play, because the risk of AI is upon us. But what's really, really critical is that vulnerable and marginalized groups that a lot of nonprofits I'm sure you spoke to work with are actually the only ones in a position to safeguard the interests of the community versus sort of getting swept up in this trend of building AI and using AI and sort of falling prey to this AI magic that we're all promised without a pinch of salt. And I think that this is something that nonprofits see not just in context of communities, but also in context of frontline workers, which a lot of nonprofits work with in India, right? There's Anganwadi workers, there's ASHA workers, there's teachers, and all of these people. And work that Nivedita and I have done together in the past on education also showed that actually teachers have all become data labelers. So instead of delivering the actual education and tracking the goals and aspirations of all of these children, they're just being forced to do a lot of data work without compensation, without value, and which takes away from time of their core jobs. So I think that nonprofits also have an additional responsibility of thinking through some of these questions around is this necessary to ask that question? And what does it give to my community beyond funder reporting and government efficiency and whatever glamorous things were promised? And how do I think more critically about the sort of input to value cycle on AI, right? Is there need to build smaller models that actually cater to my communities? Because models are being built elsewhere, right? They're being built in the US or wherever else. But our farmers in Tumkur or wherever else, they're not able to figure out like this land parcel needs this amount of fertilizer. So how do you contextualize the insights to the lived experiences of the people whose data is actually going to be a microscopic speck in the big data ecosystem that models are trained on? So I think some of those are much more on the mitigation side, because I think we all do know the risks, but that's how I view the role of nonprofits in this context.
Great. Thank you so much, Astha. I think you've raised a number of pretty important points here about things to consider in the role of nonprofits, in terms of their responsibility to the communities that they serve, as well as the contributions that they make to developing the landscape of AI use and adoption in the country, and specifically, of course, within the nonprofit sector. You've touched on a number of kind of avenues for supporting the nonprofit sector better in their endeavor to adopt AI responsibly and sustainably. Nivedita and Astha, both, if I can ask you to come back. And I'd love to hear kind of what you think nonprofits as well as ecosystem actors can do to kind of support that way forward.
Thanks, Ragini, again. Fantastic points, right? In terms of the risk and also how much therefore rests on the shoulders of nonprofits. But when you look at capacity to be able to respond to these risks, then really where are we? And I think that's where the answer is. One interesting observation from the work that we did in conversation was that in India, we're seeing this evolving category of tech enablers. So these are tech solution providers. Sometimes, I mean, then tech enablers could mean many things. One could be a set of tech for good organizations working to contextualize technology to the specific use case of nonprofits. And some of these, there is Ulloy Labs, there is Tech for Good, there are really a whole lot of them. What these organizations do is that they bring technology responsibly, and in a sense, they also sort of shoulder the ethical responsibility of bringing technology in a way that would be meaningful to the communities that ultimately, are going to interface with this, right? And the critical role that these sort of tech intermediaries play is expanding, and because we are in a sort of a fundraising conference or a conference that thinks about how one can fund this and support this. I think an important way of navigating this predicament that is before us is to invest in some of these tech enablers that then sort of go on to find these partnerships and work with nonprofits. Another important thing that I would think is important to do is that think about infrastructure broadly, right? And not just about the technology pieces of it, but also knowledge about the technology. Some of the consultations we did, and that I think continue to come up in spaces that we sort of convene, is that AI seems to be a sort of an aberration, right? And my professors in Princeton have put out this work called AI as normal technology. How can we sort of ignore the dystopian or the utopian sort of framing of technology, of AI as technology, look at it as normal technology, and then sort of develop interventions that acknowledge that tech is going to be far ahead of adoption. So the fact that Indian nonprofits are falling far behind is not concerning, or it's not shocking really. Tech does tend to be far ahead from a sort of evolution, capacity, capability, promise point of view, and adoption does fall behind. But how can we adopt in a way that is responsible and doesn't sort of deepen the divides, create more harm, benefit big tech time and time again, or even benefit the holders of data, right? I mean, I don't think it's fair to just talk about big tech, that we are in a multipolar world where whether it is big tech or it's government or civil society, those that have access to large parts of data do tend to sort of hoard data. And so how can we then develop sort of knowledge commons that allow nonprofits to understand the benefits of using technology, what realistically the tech is able to solve? We have seen nonprofits that have spent large amounts of money, let's say doing same language subtitling in Assamese or in particular dialects, having been promised the moon, but the tech solution has not necessarily been able to deliver on it meaningfully. So really, where do the capacities of technology end realistically in an Indian context? And then sort of developing that knowledge commons, sharing failure files, sharing success files, allowing a sort of an experimentation to broad base it rather than keep it as something that is exclusive for larger organizations to try their hands on. I think these are some of the ways funders as well as better resourced organizations can sort of create some interventions that bring some more equity and allow more hands to try this technology, and then also sort of work on tech enablers as a critical support system, at least in India.
Thank you so much, Nivedita. Astha, I'll ask you to come.
Yeah, I think in terms of what we need to be thinking about going forward, I think, as I mentioned, is really rethinking the role of nonprofits in this context is really important, and sort of calibrating responsibility a little bit more. So is it our responsibility to be perpetuating technologies in this way, or is it our responsibility to safeguard the interests of the community? And I think as soon as you reframe that problem, some of the questions that we've been talking about will become clearer. And then obviously there are the more sort of functional things to do in terms of awareness, in terms of thinking about how do you create circumstances in which nonprofits are able to negotiate meaningfully. Nivedita mentioned the idea of the commons. That's also something that we work on. It's terribly hard to do, but worth pursuing. And so I think also sort of decentralizing some of this bigness of AI is really critical. So how do we think about much more community-led approaches that result in smaller models, which are more energy efficient, they're more sort of contextual, and are also being developed globally. So if there is, I don't know, Tumkur district, and we know that there are 50 nonprofits that work in this district, is it possible to create more contextual models that all of those 50 organizations contribute to and benefit from? In which case, value from this becomes more decentralized, in which case the soil health data and the insights that come out from various models are more attuned to the needs of the community. And also you're able to red team it much better, which is to call out the issues that come up if the model is hallucinating for whatever reason. You're able to capture that more quickly and hold it accountable, which I see very squarely as the role of nonprofits. But you can't do that if you have, everything is in the LLM like stratosphere. I think we need to start thinking much more small language models. And also the last thing I would say is that I think nonprofits need to unbundle AI. There's this glamour around the large language models, but AI is embedded in every decision in terms of who gets credit, who gets insurance, what the premium is, etc. And I think that the role of nonprofits is also to negotiate on those fronts as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Astha. This has been very enlightening. And I think what I'm kind of seeing is the sort of takeaway here is that we would love for the black box that is AI and how it functions to kind of open up a little bit where possible for nonprofits to come together and share their experiences, successes, failures, and kind of collectively look at opportunities together. And for all the other intermediaries and kind of ecosystem actors to play whatever role they can in assisting nonprofits in navigating that highly complex landscape that is unlikely to get any less complicated anytime soon. So the better we can work together and create spaces for learning, experimentation, and hopefully safer use and more responsible use is, that's the way forward. So on that note, I will bring us to a close. And I want to say a big thank you to our experts, Nivedita and Astha, once again for joining us. Thank you so much. What you're seeing on the screen right now are QR codes that lead to reports by GivingTuesday and Pacta. We hope you'll check those out in their entirety. And thank you so much for joining us.